Hi everyone, welcome to video 1, week 9 of the Wittgenstein module. This week we're talking about private language or philosophical issues that Wittgenstein discusses with the possibility of a private language. And also we're going to be discussing Wittgenstein's treatment of sensation words, words that we use for sensations like the word pain, the word red, etc. And these two subjects are related, and Wittgenstein's treatment of them is related. So let's start in this first video looking at what's become known as the private language argument, which is supposed to be an argument Wittgenstein makes to the effect that there could be no such thing as a purely private language. So let's just back up a little bit and see how we got here. Last week we were looking at rules, paradoxes that emerge, according to Wittgenstein, when you think about our following rules in a certain way. Wittgenstein there described a kind of philosophical problem that emerges if you think of following a rule as choosing some kind of interpretation and then going with it. There's always so many interpretations of any given language use that it would be miraculous if you were to choose the right one. But Wittgenstein there said, this is what we looked at last week, Wittgenstein said, well, that's not the right way to think about rule following. Thinking about rule following in that way is what gets you into those philosophical problems. That's just a recap. Look at last week's material if you need a bit of a refresher on that. That discussion led Wittgenstein to describe language use as a collection of customs or institutions, and to think about language use as part of our culture. And so we use certain words regularly. We all use them in the same way. We don't disagree radically about word use in the ordinary case. Obviously, there are fringe cases, but mostly we use a given word, for instance, table, largely in concordance with one another. And that's because it's part of our cultural practice to do so. It's a custom. It's ingrained in us. We don't even think about it. We certainly don't all make conscious decisions about how to go and use the word. It's as natural to us to use the word table in the same way that other people do as it is to smile at people that you've met for the first time. They're both customs or features of our culture. Now, Wittgenstein's emphasis on language use as consisting in customs or cultural practices within which we're embedded gives us a picture of language as essentially social or public or requiring multiple people. I think the picture of a social language emerges because if you think of language as a custom or a cultural practice, it's not very clear that one can have purely individual culture. So Wittgenstein's discussion of language use as a custom or a cultural practice naturally makes us think of Wittgenstein's conception of language use as essentially social or public. And I think that's right. I think that is what Wittgenstein thinks. And then there's a natural objection to Wittgenstein, which is the subject of this first video, which is something like, well, on your view of language, it's essentially social, it's essentially cultural practice within which we're embedded. And the objection is, well, that rules out the possibility of private languages. And Wittgenstein's opponent might say, well, I think you can have such a thing as a private language, a language for oneself only. And consequently, your view of language must be wrong because it rules out that possibility. And I think it is a possibility, says the opponent. So I think Wittgenstein feels that he wants to take this proposal head on now. This idea that you can have a purely private language, because if you could have such a thing, it might raise a problem for his the kind of view of language which he's endorsing. So he takes it on. He says, well, okay, let's imagine such a thing if we can. And he says, and one of the main passages here is 258. He says, let's imagine the following case. I want to keep a diary about the recurrence of a certain sensation. To this end, I associate it with the sign S and write this sign in a calendar for every day on which I have the sensation. Then he says, how can I point to the sensation? Not in the ordinary sense. And so, as it were, I've got to point to it inwardly. So let's first take this thought experiment and think about it. This is a hypothetical, purely private language. And Wittgenstein's going to unravel it and demonstrate that the idea is incoherent, basically. But he wants to set up the thought experiment first. So, what would a purely private language be like? Well, what sorts of things are purely private? Ordinarily, we think of the private sphere as the sphere of sensation, one's emotions, one's mental imagery, all of the things which sometimes are referred to as our kind of inner life. So Wittgenstein says, well, okay, if you want a private language, it's got to be to do with those things, probably, setting up the thought experiment. So let's imagine that you try and set up a private language. You have a sensation and you want to baptize that sensation with a name or a word which only you understand. Only you understand it because only you have access to the thing it names. This is the idea. So let's imagine you have some kind of sensation, whatever you want. Close your eyes and imagine something, and you go S. And this is the example of you trying to set up a purely private language. You go S, and you keep a calendar or a diary, and every time you have the sensation, you mark down an S on the diary at the time at which you think you had that sensation. So this is the idea. This is a supposedly private language. No one else can understand it because no one's got access to your own inner life, your mental imagery or sensations. No one else can know what S stands for. Only you can. So it's purely private. Now Wittgenstein says, though, but in this case, I have no criterion of correctness. One would like to say, whatever is going to seem right to me is right. And that only means that here we can't talk about right. So there's a question here of how is it that you know, let's say you've had a sensation and you go S. Let's say you have another sensation tomorrow. How do you know whether that sensation is the same one which you've called S or a different one? Now, Wittgenstein's point is that if you decide that that new sensation is sufficiently like the first one to call it S, then you can go, right, I've got a new sensation, but it's another instance of that one I had yesterday, so it qualifies as being called S. You go, okay, that's S. Okay, that's one option. The other option is that you decide that this new sensation isn't sufficiently similar to the old one to qualify as still being called S. And so you go, no, that's not an instance of S. I can't use S here. And Wittgenstein says, well, given this choice whether to call a new sensation S or not, there's no criterion of being correct. Whatever seems to you right is right. So, in other words, when you're confronted with new sensations and you have to decide about whether they qualify as S or not, there's no real criteria for you to bring to bear in order to make that decision. If you decide the new sensation qualifies as S, then it does. If you decide it doesn't, then it doesn't. And so Wittgenstein says, well, if you can't be wrong about whether you're using that word S correctly, if it's just not possible for you to misuse the word, then it's not clear what use that word could have. The point is that if it's never possible that you use the word mistakenly, he doesn't think it's possible for you to ever use the word correctly, or more specifically, he doesn't really think it makes sense to talk about correct use or incorrect use of the word. There's no such thing as being correct about your use of the word S, because there's no such thing as being incorrect. You couldn't be incorrect. This is what Wittgenstein thinks. And so, whatever you say is right. You can't be wrong, but ordinarily we think that there has to be a right way to use a word and a wrong way. Wittgenstein has examples of this. So, for instance, if someone pinches me and I say I'm in pain, everyone would say, yeah, that's fine. You seem to have used the word correctly. I mean, they wouldn't actually do that, but no one would raise any eyebrows about your use of the word pain. If you said, though, something like this, you go to the doctors and you say you've got some kind of issue, and they go, right, what's going on? You say, well, I really believe that I've got an incredibly sharp pain in my leg, but I don't know if I've got that pain. I think I might be mistaken. Well, then the doctor is going to say, Wittgenstein thinks, you don't really understand what the word pain means there. Your use of it is so bizarre that we've got to assume that you don't understand English. And another example of misuse of the word pain is Wittgenstein says is someone saying, no, I know what pain is, I just don't know whether this sensation counts as pain. Well, that seems strange. It seems to be part of the use of the word pain that you can't be uncertain about whether your sensations count as painful or not. And it's also part of the use of the word pain that you can't merely believe and fail to know that you're in pain. So our words have criteria for being used correctly and incorrectly. If a word could never be used incorrectly, it's very unclear what utility there would be in using the word. It would just be a sound that's legitimate to use in any and every situation, completely indiscriminately, and what would be the point of making the sound? And so this private word, S, is looking, Wittgenstein says, like a noise like that. it can be used in any and every situation if you decide it can be. And so it doesn't function like a normal word. And normal words function like that. They can be used rightly or wrongly because they're useful. So Wittgenstein thinks really the conception of a purely private language collapses here. He gives another sort of related argument. He says in section 265, let us imagine a table, something like a dictionary, that exists only in our imagination. A dictionary can be used to justify the translation of a word X by a word Y. But are we also to call it a justification if such a table is to be looked upon only in the imagination? Well, yes, then it is subjective justification. But justification consists in appealing to something independent. This is the main point. I'll repeat it. But justification consists in appealing to something independent. And then the response is, but surely I can appeal from one memory to another. For example, I don't know if I have remembered the time of departure of a train ride, and to check it, I call to mind how a page of the timetable looked. Isn't it the same here? And Wittgenstein answers, no, for this process has got to produce a memory which is actually correct. If the mental image of the timetable could not itself be tested for correctness, how could it confirm the correctness of the first memory? He says, as if someone were to buy several copies of the morning paper to assure himself that what it said was true. So Wittgenstein's point here is this. Well, you say, no, I know whether I'm using the word S correctly or not because I've got a kind of mental table. Let's say I've got, if I try and remember the table, I've got a mental image of the sensation and then the word S next to it. And if I come across a new sensation, then I just consult my imaginary table and judge the sensation according to that table, and then I can say, well, it meets that criteria. I'll call it S. But Wittgenstein's point is that your imaginary table doesn't itself have any independent check on whether it is correct. And so he says, it's not going to help. There's no test for correctness. You've invented a test of correctness, but who's to say whether that test of correctness is correct or not? It's another problem that Wittgenstein raises against the possibility of private language. And so I think that these are the main arguments he gives. Another argument he gives, finally for this video, relates back to what we discussed when we first looked at the Tractatus. So if you'll remember, when we first looked at the Tractatus, we said that ostensive definition, i.e. pointing at things and naming them, isn't the foundation upon which language is based. Rather, ostensive definition only works if you already know how to use language. Again, go back to that week if you need a refresher on this idea. Ostensive definition only helps you if you have an idea of what kind of thing is being pointed to. So if someone just points at an object and makes a sound, it's completely indeterminate what precisely they're pointing to. If they point at an object and go, look, that wood is mahogany, you can understand it if you already know what wood means, what colours are, etc. And more importantly, you can only understand an ostensive definition if you have some grasp of this whole idea of naming things. There's a whole practice which people do, which is called naming things, and that is a kind of language game which we play in our culture. It's something that we do, we're familiar with it. But if someone points at an object and makes a sound, and you have got no idea of what this practice of naming is, you've never been introduced to that culture, you won't be able to grasp that naming has gone on. You won't go, oh, I see, they're associating a sound with a thing. That means I've got to associate a sound with a thing. You won't do that because you've not been introduced to that whatsoever. And so Wittgenstein points out the same problem occurs here. He says that you forget that a lot of stage setting, he calls it, has to be in place before naming things makes sense. And this person who is trying to construct a private language, we've got to assume that they can't already use our public language in order to make their private language. We've got to start them from nothing. They've never used language. They don't have any of our culturally ingrained habits. They've got nothing. And so they've never embarked upon the practice of naming before. And so they've got to invent this practice by themselves in order for naming to catch on, in order for them to be able to go, right, sensation, S. So Wittgenstein points out that the whole model, the whole hypothetical situation which we've got here is premised on smuggling in this idea that the person setting up the language already does have a grasp on the practice of naming. They know what ostensive definition is, etc. And also they'll be confronted with the problem that they're trying to set up a language with ostensive definition. And Wittgenstein has, we've already seen, been concerned to show that you can't get from no language to language with ostensive definition. Ostensive definition only works if you already know how to speak. And so I think Wittgenstein is raising criticisms that he's already raised at, for instance, Augustine, against the person who wants to set up a private language, or the person who thinks that it's conceivable that there should be a private language. And Wittgenstein also points out that when we're talking about this person who's setting up a private language, we're saying they have a sensation and then they name the sensation. Wittgenstein points out, though, that the word sensation is a word from our culture, our custom, our linguistic practice. And if we're trying to conceive of someone inventing a language which has got nothing to do with our public, custom-based, culture-based language, he asks twice, what right have we got to call this thing that he's naming a sensation? Again, we're kind of smuggling in features of our language games into that person's attempt to construct a private language. And so for all of these reasons, which we'll go into more in the in-person sessions, Wittgenstein is throwing a lot of doubt upon the possibility of a private language. And it's fairly clear that he thinks that it's just an incoherent notion, really. An incoherent hypothetical. And so it doesn't raise a problem for his view of language as custom or cultural practice based. So I think that's it for this video. I think in the next video we want to look at Wittgenstein's discussion of why it is that we are led into the trap of thinking that you could have a private language, when he thinks that you can't, obviously. Okay, thanks everyone, see you in the next video.